She said, tradition ain't nothing but peer pressure from dead folks. And when I tell you that when Goody Howard at Ask Goody said this, it really just sat in my spirit. And I realized that Marc Lamont Hill and the guys on the Joe Budden Podcast, they were really having a conversation about tradition. Watch this clip.
I don't want my wife to have my last name.
So in tradition, right? The wife takes the husband's last name, correct? Would you say that?
In America, yeah. Before I ever met my wife, I didn't want my future wife to have my last name.
Only the children, though. The children.
We share names. We have my children are hyphenated. All my children are hyphenated for that reason. Because they're both of ours.
So my question was, did y'all get married at a church or anything like that?
No.
Did y'all do anything else traditional in terms of your marriage or your wedding?
No, but I'm not against tradition. I'm saying I just don't believe that every tradition you have to keep going
Just
if you
that
don't
one.
believe.
You just didn't like that?
No, there's other traditions I'm sure we don't believe in as well. I'm just saying, like, just because you've been doing something for a long time doesn't mean you have to keep doing it, because some traditions aren't healthy and some traditions don't work for everybody.
You see what I mean? Now, if you need to watch the rest of the episode so that you can get further context, I suggest you do so. But this conversation about taking and giving of last names and all that, I think it's a conversation that we should have right after the intro. And welcome back to another episode of the Daily Donna with me, your host, Dr. Donna Oriel, a sex and relationship therapist in the Washington, D.C. metro area, author of Drink Water and Mind Your Business, a Black woman's guide to unlearning the BS and healing self-esteem. I thought that it would be very important for us to have this conversation, and I'm going to bring my therapist hat, consider it firmly placed upon my head. But also we got to talk about things from a historical standpoint as well. So I started with the quote that I started with from Goody Howard because sometimes we don't recognize, or we're not yet ready to contend with the fact that we are invoking traditionalist thoughts that we have not even had the time to really sit in and think about. Why have we continued with this so-called tradition? Now, the tradition here is the taking of a last name when one gets married. Now, I'm not here to tell you whether or not it's right or wrong, because it's not about whether or not it's right or wrong for me. It's about whether or not it's right or wrong for you. As for me in my house, no, I did not take anybody else's last name. And I will give you my reasons soon. But let's talk about this from a historical standpoint first. Historically, women were seen as the property of their father. And because you were the property of your father, it is your father's job to basically ask for an exchange for you to be married with somebody. Now, some people, there's a dowry involved. There's I'll give you these chickens. You give me your daughter, right? Like it's an exchange. As a matter of fact, I want to say that they talk about that exchange. Owen Wilson's character talked about it in Marry Me. And I think that people forget that that was the historical context, that a person was considered property. I know. With the historical context of these United States, where it relates to chattel slavery history, I think it's sometimes lost on people that women were not independent people, but were the properties of their fathers. And that in the wedding, part of the old world tradition of a father taking your hand and placing it into the hand of the person you're going to marry is to indicate a change in ownership. And that your property went from being your dad's property, who could be last name Jones, to your husband's property, who might be last name Smith. So you changed your name because it was an indication of change of ownership. Ever. It's 2026, friend. And I recognize that, yes, there are other reasons why we continue on with this tradition. And for some people, they continue it because they ain't thought about it. But some other people continue with this tradition because while they may have this historical context, for them, it is still important that the entire family have the same last name.
Married, we're becoming one house, like one family, one household, all of that shit, then yes, you're taking my last name.
Mm-hmm. Tradition, all of those things that we build, and we trying to build our name, or, you know what I'm saying?
Well, your name.
So, no, our.
Then why don't you take hers?
A girl's father, that was their family. That's their family's name. So it's patriarchy, but
okay.
I'm not disagreeing with you. I
agree
with
That's patriarchy?
That's what
It is.
It's kind of rooted in it.
It's rooted in
Of
patriarchy.
course it is. You're literally saying I'm her daddy now.
No,
But as you can see in the conversation that they had, they did not consider that the having of the same last name could be that all parties involved change the last name. But no, there is an expectation that a woman who's marrying a man changes her last name to match that of her man. That is also another tradition. It is a tradition steeped in the original tradition, is the change of the ownership, but also it is steeped in the idea of the patriarchy that a man can own and should own a woman by way of what his propertied wife gives birth to, or by way of what property he purchased as a wife. So in the end of the day, it's still about the exchange of goods. Now, with time and with the moving away of marriage for purely financial gains and moving into the idea of choosing a love and choosing to be with somebody, and that's what that growth in space for choice, it has changed thus the way that we do relationships. But that tradition of needing to change one's last name has gone largely unexamined. At least unexamined by them. I mean, other people have clearly examined it. So a little bit of my tea. I chose not to change my name. Part of the reason I chose not to change my name is because Dr. Donna Oriowo was a doctor with this last name. Number two, I had no reason to change my last name. I don't believe that the love is less because the last name is not changed. I call myself by my husband's last name, and on occasion it tickles him. He enjoys it. But it is not a requirement of my relationship or a way for me to prove loyalty or commitment to my relationship by changing my last name. And I'll say that another piece of the reason I didn't want to change my last name is because who the heck is doing all that paperwork? But consider that in relationships, generally speaking, I'm talking about heterosexual relationships specifically, that women tend to be the ones who are most likely to use or do the invisible labor in their relationship, which basically requires the use of their executive functioning skills. We've talked about that several times before. So the executive functioning skills include organization and planning. And there is work that is required to change over one's last name because all of your documents will also need to reflect this new last name. So there's a lot of work that goes into it. And quite frankly, there are a lot of men outside who have different executive functioning skills that are not necessarily relational in the way that they use them because they're not taught in that way. They're not socialized in that way. And who have the added bonus of patriarchy telling them that you are less of a man if your wife doesn't take your last name, or worse, if you take hers. I like that he was talking about that there have been matrilineal lines. And I feel like we already know about matrilineal lines. We just have a different way of saying it, right? Mama's baby, daddy's maybe, right? It's always a yes. We know who the mama is. We don't know who that pawpaw is. We don't know until we know, right? Because if it came out of her, it's probably hers. Right? It just, maybe. You let me know in the comments below whether or not it could be somebody else's. And I guess it could be, if you're a surrogate. But the idea of mama's baby's daddy's maybe is about the knowledge that we can track people through the matrilineal line. But because of the power that has been wanted by patriarchy, we track people by the patriarchal line, despite the fact that it often makes less sense to do so. This has been normed, and so it is a work that a woman must do, the paperwork and all that other stuff of changing the last name, that is simply expected. And what I enjoy about these conversations is that Marc Lamont Hill is bringing in a space where they get to now confront what has been traditional, what has been untalked about, what has not been thought about as far as the practices that they expect from a partner that they believe is loyal to them, and what functions that they would actually have to manifest in order for it to be seen as this is a good thing, or for us to be seen as a family, right? The act of being a family is choosing that you are family. And a lot of people, I think that because the white supremacist space has deemed family to be family by blood, that it becomes a space where Black folks, sometimes we can be both in and out at the same time. And what I mean by that is we could be in and out at the same time is that we want that thing, right? We want to be legitimized, whether or not we say it. There's a desire to be legitimized by the dominating culture, while also still practicing our own practices of fictitious kin, where you can have like a cousin that's not really your cousin. Like, you know how like somebody's your auntie, but of no blood relation, right? When I talk about my aunt in the book, of no blood relation. And it's just like, you have this fictitious family. They're no less your family in the way that you carry yourself, in the way that you behave, and in the expectations that are set within your family dynamic, because they are family. And somehow it stops applying when it comes to marriage. And I know that some of it has to do with the way that it is seen as a one down thing, that it's like you're not really a man because your wife didn't take your last name. It also ends up being an indictment on Black families because they don't have the last name. So it is assumed that there is overly sexually promiscuous behavior, and that the reason you don't have the last name is because, you know, daddy or mammy was stepping out with all these other people, because we are assumed to be sexually deviant simply because we're Black, not because of any other thing that we have done. So you've got this other element that is like, well, I want to prove that we are the right type of Black people by all making sure that we have the same last name. But also you have the liberation of women that also comes into play, in that women no longer require marriage in order to have access to life. Now women can choose whether or not they will be married, and whether or not they will, knowing that they still have access to life, regardless of whether or not they choose to be with anyone at all. So I found this conversation to be quite delightful, because they are picking apart these various parts while also having to contend with their own feelings. There's a space between what we know and want, like when we get that new knowledge, right? Like that knowing better and that doing better, because knowing better gives you an opportunity to do better, but we don't often do the work that is required to do the part where we do better. So despite the fact that people can know better, do better about the history of why names were changed, that it was an indicator of changing one ownership to something else, the fact is that the meaning behind this action has also transformed with time, and is also transforming again, given the way that marriages go now versus how marriages were going then, versus all this other stuff. So now it is an indicator of family, of kinship, of love, of care. It's an indicator of sameness, of oneness. But for some, it is also still seen as an indicator of oppression. And it's why I think it's important for us to sit in the fact that things can be a both and that it does us a disservice to make things into an either or. It's not Black or white. It's all shades of gray. And the best way to move forward is the best way for you, which means that if you want to change your last name, change it. If you don't want to change your last name, don't change it. Either way, have the conversation with your lover about how you would both like to proceed. I think that we forget that there are multiple options available to us. In the case of any relationship, person one can change their last name to person two. Person two can change their last name to person one, or both people can choose an entirely different last name. I have seen that happen. Some people choose to hyphenate, but sometimes people like legitimately will go, they'll do some research, they'll choose a region, they'll choose a place, they'll choose a language and choose a last name that they want to represent their family moving forward. Now, I know that some people feel like, well, that's the end of your legacy. That's the end of your line. It's the same thing if Like, my father only has daughters. If all of us get married and change our last name, then the last name, Oriole, dies. It dies with him. Like, his legacy doesn't continue. And yet, I think that we need to have a conversation about what legacy is, because half the time what y'all mean is just progeny and money, and there's more to legacy than that. Because when you think about the legacy of Malcolm X, when you think about the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King, when you think about the legacy of, yes, I'm going to say Rosa Parks, when you think about the legacy of George Washington Carver, of Shirley Chisholm, when you think about any of these Black folks' legacy, you know what you don't tend to think about? Their money or their children. Because legacy moves beyond such simple and silly definitions, because money is fleeting. You have it, it goes, it comes again. It's cyclical, right? And whether or not you have children almost matters not at all. Like, when y'all talk about Whitney Houston, yes, we know that she did have a child and that child has also passed. And yet, when you talk about her legacy, y'all don't really mention her child as part of her legacy. You mention the way that she treated other female artists. You mention the way that she uplifted the Black community. You mentioned that she was the voice, right? That she was the voice of a generation. You talk about her talent. You talk about her friendship, her kinship with others. That's what you talk about, because that is her legacy. But because the patriarchy and men have glommed into the patriarchy, which reduces their function to being wallets and to being sex machines, especially for Black men, right? Like the Black buck narrative, it then becomes that the legacy for a Black man becomes whether or not he had children and whether or not he has money. Despite the fact that it's only going to take a generation for people to forget both. Well, maybe not really forget both. No one's going to really forget your kids, not the people that are closest to you, but the people who know you maybe from, who don't get to love you up close, who don't get to love this person up close. Your legacy is not going to be your offspring. Your legacy is not going to be the money you left behind, unless you left such a significant amount of money behind that you transform several neighborhoods, right? Like, if a billionaire wants to leave me in the will, let me know so I can make sure I spell my last name properly for you, right? Those things are not your legacy. Those things, I would say, are leftovers, right? Leftovers in the fridge are not your legacy. They just leftovers, right? It's something that someone else gets to consume. It's something that might live on in your fridge with that mold, that because you ain't throw it out, right? That's not legacy. That's just leftovers. The money, the children, these are leftovers. These are leftovers from your time here on earth. Your legacy is how people remember you, how you behaved here, how people felt in their connection with you. Those things are more part of your legacy than your leftovers. And I think that if we could reframe legacy into leftovers versus actual legacy, I think that we would be having different conversations. And if men allowed themselves to be something more than a wallet, something more than their penis, and something more than what their penis can produce, and allow their life to be the show of their production. Oh my God. I wonder what would change. I wonder if they would feel as attached to the need for a last name that is only indicative of what you had for a moment before you left for the rest of someone else's lifetime. Anyway, those are my thoughts. I would love to know yours. Remember, discourse, not disrespect. What do you think about this name change thing? Are you a person that has or would change your last name? Do you expect somebody to change their last name to yours? And have you ever, and be honest, honest conversation, have you actually considered whether or not you want to change your last name? Or do you feel have you ever thought about whether or not you need for the last names to be the same in order to be considered a family? Let me know in the comments below. Y'all already know what I said. Discourse, not disrespect. And this is the Daily Donna. I am Dr. Donna, and I will be back tomorrow, because we have these conversations daily. All right. Bye.